I am Tomiwa Folorunso. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a writer, editor, and cultural producer raised in Edinburgh and currently based in Brussels, where I'm studying an MA in cultural studies. I'm really happy to be here today. This is my first time in the borders, I'm ashamed to say. So it is really nice to be here in Hawick, especially joined by this wonderful panel for today's event, Broadcast, which is about Scotland's languages. And today we'll be considering the experiences of working in multilingual communities, prioritising minoritised languages and embracing languages other than English as a vibrant influence in our community and creative lives. We're going to do this event in two parts, with a little break in between before we can really get into the discussion. I'm going to introduce our panel, and they're also going to give us a short opener in a language of their choice. So we have two cultural collective projects represented here today. Ghazi Hussein from Art27 in Edinburgh and Artair Donald, a Gaelic artist in residence at Highland Cultural Collective. So, Artair, would you like to give us your opener?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with I'm a small white Scottish man with a red face and he, him. Féiscear ma gaibh ule. Is misha Artair Donald agus ha mi gopar mar neach drama bhainteras mar fárs de skipe co chuman cultar na Gaeltach agus sinne mar fárs in chuman cultar náisiúnta. Cool Ístrachach. Ha misha hokol an na áide gríanach bria, Elen hirig als een eentje gaal, voor een roslooig de sheach kiet geleid. Nu de haas ik mee zijn skaal. You okay there? No, it's okay. Carry on. Nu de haas ik mee zijn skaal, haar o fachtel pierre atom. Je Gaelic canon begeeldig agus shin rakel. Huik mee geneem, met beerde Engelse gemal loe, je weet het rakel het jirig. Ach geforst nog, ha wie me fijne belters en klech me goed Gaelic. Maar de hacher in mijn water is gelauwd elle angst de koikeren se schiskete. Ze drama hoek madde, maar een slier oprug waar met alle lenting naar mijn weg. Is maar schön, ha mir wie kopper aan een theater, radio, television, agus film, zo'n barak met tricket, Leonard. Kreetjes in majedig, Mary Queen of Scots, banen, agus comedy show oer, o mochrech. Het haar elders accommodee, wie is stuurde boetjen oprug, agus jalden gloeik, le scalarin, giagrin agus cairsneachcin Gaelic, harish na blianachin. Smar sin, sé urum vor hangá a bhín an fást in cóchoman cultar náisiúnta. Bhí an opar gom hasir féis scailtin agus cairsneach an sa Gaeltach, scíre go má farsing is scafte. Le bhí brian recording na Gaeltach is compárscin ille an sa project, hainsin na scírin ag ar na féimlachcin is smá. Sé amas an opar acum a bhí brosnach scalarin is giagrin, gehaardig le cleachke is een lesige Gaelicachke. Is tokki seo misneach an een aumri tjeach. Wie me kopper gehaardig le oikri gaal amach tar Gaelic trai COVID. Gehaardig van de Gaelic ans een tajachke. En ik gelijking eif op jasjach is baajach sa hanen agus een doelges. Kudjach bi me kiensgeif met een karmen oprige handen zo de Gaelic. Sket bi deunje kursiers er Gaelic, bi tar deunje le beerle een kopper aan de zo de Gaelic, agus et Giano Joe Hussein. In draaste ha mi gopper aan een skaltje aan de Malik, ach arakel agus lachapper. Ha mi torsteich je skalleren aan de aardskal Malik agus lachapper. Scriptich in schrijven zo'n film gerich. Ziet de Christiach zo'n farpisch nationte film G. Ha sja kutje lis na skillen schrijvi is laverstjachke. Is het tokkel misnjach big weg. Ha mi kutjach de torsteich je skalleren klas 1-3 agus klas 4 gesjeach om het bunskal gariko. Ha je schrijven pantomime as oer zo'n gach klas het je te klare is een 5e paarden skill het nolk YouTube or en je kit ek paarden alles die in een skaltje haast. Bevoor hutjen op het tachas aan de skieren Google van de gillen urit jigurissen neer karben. Leed stalk cinema, theater, amar snav is ille. De waarach we koper aan de skaltjen, bij me vier kenlichen in jano, de innerweg, agus kurtai sessionen, en wie is frikkerig is kutschgeljai. Maar exemplar, klassische Gaelic, taasje puin oer drama kajersnjach, na rutken, ik wil oei ach geheen. Bij een karmenschen femel, en na herm, nam ik weer koper aan de skieren, voor een taar teunje en nui en Gaelic. Sjá voor een doelen. Onze skieren sjá ha barach wie aan de eun het Gaelic, na ha ounce en skal björle. De aarde van toegtje onze björle, is barach het aan Gaelic, kaili lucht de björle, teacher, nor le hitcher. En sjá een keelge, ik wil viewingje vaarten, gema vieig, als het kurgudde het Gaelic, is toegtje een maag is gele. En je suig ma a haun, agus bij meer kurtai sessionen le inewig, is een teach, trui fistergug, na ge drachrut te haun, en die daar gaan nog. Haar ons gesaai se kiens junker rut ma haun, agus gero klachke barach je janoche. Kutjach kan sasse, tres kanen iunzig. En je drach rut ta schön. Wie nou ik de kiens gapi, buch knapjel kurschies regalig, ex het haring aste me je. Wie me nou ik wie praschel, agus lager me in de skillen a hachke. De Michel ik wil woog onze goede kanen, agus nog het björle ach oen kanen, en mache barach na sjach miele kanen, et fe en teug. Tach.
Thank you, Artair. Ghazi is now going to perform something.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to speak and read a poem. But first of all, I would like to thank you first and thank Artair 27 as an artist in residence in Art 27, which Robert and Helen, our organizer for this organization, which give us freedom and space and give us voice to celebrate and practice our culture and language. So I'm going to read a poem called Return the Dream in Arabic. سأعود وأبدأ عودتي خطا على وجه الصباح إلى الفجر ثم إلى ليل نسيت فيه حلمي سأهديه بقايا العمر وكل الدموع وأرفع للموت رايات سلمي وأجعل من جسدي رصيف ياسمين يمتد من هجرتي إلى أطراف قريتي ليعبر شوقي إلى حضن أمي وأصنع من ضلوعي زنابق ومن لوعتي أبني الجسور ليعبر قلبي نازفا عطر الزهور يكفن الموت ويلغي القبور ويخضر دمي وأشدو بلحن رخيم حزين آلام شعبي فتدمع عيني وحولي العيون ويلتم شملي وأرسم الوداع على وجه الحبيب نجوما تشع بأنوار حبي وأحبو حتى الوصول وأطبع نفسي عند النزول قبلات على أقدام أمي.
Thank you, Ghazi. Thank you. Jamie and Harry, Josephine, I haven't forgotten about you, but I just wanted to chat to Artair and Ghazi a little bit because you're both cultural collective projects. So, Artair, how is your project going so far?
It's okay.
Well, yeah, it's going well. I think we're right in the middle of it. I think we're 7 weeks in. So my main thing is working with schools and helping young people and students who lost out in their Gaelic education, really, especially those that don't have any Gaelic at home. So I've been in the schools now for 7 weeks and working in different projects. Some it's acting for camera lessons and using Gaelic, and the younger ones were writing pantomime scripts in Harrical one for class 1 to 3 and one for class 4 to 7. So that's interesting. But that, as I said earlier, was that you can't just send away for an English, like you can send away for an English pantomime. We don't have the same resources in Gaelic, so it's easier for us to write one, and then it comes from the young people's own ideas. It's local, and I think it helps their writing skills and their speaking skills a lot more than just something that's already written.
Yeah.
And it also gives them more ownership, which I think makes them more proud. So we're very happy with that. We're just at the stage now of getting ready in another week of rehearsals, I think, and then 2 weeks of filming.
Very nice.
And kind of on location with those pupils. So we're going to the local garage where they'll try to fix Santa's sleigh that's crash landed and things like that. So he's crash landed in the Harricle and people aren't going to have Christmas. So there's a race against time to, and that's all their own kind of ideas. And I prefer much more that than coming in and saying, this is what we're doing. And as I say, they have more fun with that and do it. So at that stage, we're quite well on. In Malig, we've had a few sessions there with pupils, and they were more about making a public information video about the tourist season and camper vans parking in front of their gardens and things like that. So more a kind of awareness of where you park your vehicles and things. But it's quite interesting that somebody in Primary 7 feels quite strongly about camper vans parking in front of their garden just because it's right in front of the sea there at Malig.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a huge problem. And what's the response been like? How are like the kids and the pupils enjoying it? Are they excited about it? Or have there been kind of like any hesitation?
What I've found is that some schools, so up in the Highlands, we still have in some of the schools, most of the schools, you still have to wear masks when you're teaching. So I found that I haven't been teaching properly, I guess, for almost 2 years with the pandemic. And then first time teaching, my glasses on, everything was steaming up. So that didn't look very professional, but I soon got used to that and got around it. And I think so at Malig High School in the primary school, they find it harder to be flexible in bringing you in. Whereas the Harricle's kind of opened up its arms and will take me as many hours as possible. I think they see it, I think all schools find it's a very positive impact. But Harricle, I think, sees all kind of, they've got music tutors in there too. And what you might be halfway through your rehearsal and the tutor will come and take a boy or girl away for 10 minutes, 15 minutes to do their accordion or pipes or whatever. So it's full on, and I quite like the fact that they're well into the arts, because not everybody will be good at maths either, so I quite like that. So they have opened their arms up, and there's a real positive atmosphere in the whole place. And to be fair, there's 12 speaking English pupils in that school as well. The numbers have overtaken in Gaelic. So I've also done workshops with them, because I think although they're not studying Gaelic, they're well aware of it, they're very open to it, and they're happy to learn a few Gaelic phrases, and they've enjoyed the games and the exercises. So it's not a case of going and leaving them out because they're not speaking, it's all about sharing together. And I think, it's just a great school, to be honest. Yeah. And Malig's also wonderful, just it's harder to make enough time, I guess, just because of facilities and resources.
But the pupils are loving it.
I think so. I always say you have to ask them, but I think they always say Mating va Artair. They always say good morning Artair when I arrive. So I think at least they're glad to see me.
Yeah, that's a good start.
It's not no, it's that.
They hate it. And I suppose you mentioned some of the challenges, but have there been any other challenges, I think, of this project did you have any hesitations before going in and embarking on this?
Well, I guess the only thing is Highland region, as I said in my opening, I don't know if you saw the subtitles, but Highland region is a large region and well spread. So I guess you can't possibly cover the whole lot. But what we've done is broken it into 4 terms. And at the moment, we're kind of at the west. Next term will be in the middle, I guess, of Inverness Shire. Then we'll be in the east. And then the last term will be up north in Sutherland. So even the more rural areas will get some of my time. And hopefully one of our other Highland Culture Collective colleagues, Sinead O'Hargan, is up there, and maybe it'll be a chance for us to work together with some of the school pupils, and that would be quite good as well. I think as part of the collective, it's funny being part of the collective, but also being by yourself up in those country roads. So it's good to be here and meet people today and actually think, oh yeah, I am part of the collective. Yeah. So if that makes sense, I think others are out by themselves too, and so far so good, I think.
Good, thank you. And now to your fellow network, part of your network, Ghazi. How's your residency going?
It's going very, very good.
Yeah.
Because we work as a team in this R27, and everybody support the other person and support in the community, and we get support from the community around us. And we have so many projects in the organization going on, and I like do something in that project which teaching supposed to be poetry for survival, but now I start with the calligraphy workshops, which is going good, I think. It's the feedback I get from the parents more than from the kids is good. The kids is very shy to say things, but
they keep coming back. The kids keep coming.
Yeah,
So it must be good.
They still come and increase the number, which is encouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really good. And what kind of calligraphy?
I done Arabic calligraphy with them and English. They are preferring English, but we try to concentrate in Arabic because the language is very important. Is the language for any person is like the identity of the person, because if I'm in the street, I hear somebody speaking Scottish or Gaelic, I say that he's Scottish. I identify that person. And they say your tongue is your address. If I hear Glaswegian, he's from Glasgow. He's a Scottish from Glasgow. And that's our words is like our mirror. So reflecting our culture, our education, our politics, our morality as well. So I think we trying hard with Robert and Helen and the other artists to support this kind of crucial things in people's life. So, but my experience, as a when as a person who my English used to be very, 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 very bad. Mm-hmm. Nowadays is very bad. Just And when is my experience. I'm going to speak about my experience because we're speaking about language, and language is very important. So my experience here is my problem used to be because I don't talk.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to talk. That's half of my problem. The other half of the problem, when I talk, because I say things different than what I meant to say. And people misunderstand. And that's misunderstanding between me and the other person is make a distance of misunderstanding. And that distance is very difficult to cross it. Because people will accuse you are stupid because you don't understand. And that is cruel. Yes, I know stupidity is a talent of misunderstanding, but I'm not stupid. I have funny stories, if you want me to just tell the stories about misunderstanding. When I came, I just have a problem with my accommodation because it was in my YMCA and it was very crowded. And I go to complain, I go to Scottish Refugee Council, the only place you can go to and complain. So I went there, and I used to have a pocket dictionary, small dictionary. I don't have 5 English words I know. Yes, no, okay, thank you, bye. That's what I know. So I have that pocket dictionary, and I went shouting at the Refugee Council in Arabic. And a woman came from the office. I remember her name, Charlie. She said, Ghazi, calm down. I take my dictionary, open it, look at it, and I went down the stairs. I found myself in the toilet. I said, why she sent me to the toilet? I don't need a toilet. I need an accommodation, other accommodation. I went up again and start shouting more and more, because when there's misunderstanding, your voice going higher and higher and higher. So I start shouting more. And she came out again and she said, Ghazi, calm down. I said, you are a liar. I've been down. Why you send me to the toilet? And that is the misunderstanding. I think she was very helpful. At the end, I found out she's very helpful, but because the misunderstanding make a big gap between us.
Yeah.
Another story you would like it?
I mean, I could listen to your stories all day,
right.
but
I went back because I like telling these stories. It's funny, but because of misunderstanding, it's important to say. I went back to YMCA where I used to live, and the YMCA was very crowded. And when you call the lift, you need to wait about 20 minutes for the lift. I was standing on the front of the lift, and the Scottish guy came with a big black dog. And I tried to avoid the dog because it was cold, and I want to go to pray. If the dog touched me, I have to wash again. So I avoid to. And the guy looked at me at the face, and he think I'm just being bad to the dog. He said the fa off word to me. I don't know what it is. I take my dictionary, look, doesn't have that word. And I looked at him, and I start using my cleverness, my how smart I am. I figure it out. I said, I remember Russian names. Russian names end with "ov," all of it. Klashenkov, Degtyaryov, Kharashov, Gorbachev. I look at him, I said, well, I'm not Russian. And he said, "Fa in black." So I didn't know what it is. My dictionary again, and doesn't have that word. So I start figure it out, and I looked to the dog. I said, the dog name is that. In. I said, you have a big in your flat. We're not allowed to have one like this. I thought that's where is the name of the dog. So that's a misunderstanding. He looked at me again and said, stupid. The only words I found it in my dictionary is stupid. And I said, the stupidity is the talent of misunderstanding. And that's where it's, I think it is very important to just be a peaceful friend to other person, to understand, or just leave the other person in peace. Anyway, yes.
Thank you. There was lots of things you said that you both said actually that I want to come back to after our break. But before we have our break, we've got two more panel members, two more very special panel guests here with us today. So Harry Josephine Giles is a writer and performer from Orkney living in Leith, and their verse novel Deep Wheel Orcadia was published by Picador in October 21. Like, it's a month old. Congratulations. Harry Josephine, would you like to share your opener with us?
Yes. Just before the opener, a visual description. I'm a tall, white trans woman out with her in Scots with mid-length brown hair, rafsy. I'm wearing a white t-shirt with a Frida Kahlo print and a black skirt and silver hoops in me lugs and a steel necklace with a tour card for the tarot on it, which is maybe a bit of a risky emblem to wear, but it's the mood that I'm in. So, my name's Harry Josephine, Josie for short, and I'm a writer and performer for Orkney, the Northern Isles of Scotland. The language I'm speaking now is Orcadian, the Orkney dialect, and it's the language of me islands. It's a dialect of Scots with gay strong influences for Old Norse. About half the folk at home speak it as a first language. That's 10,000 folk. And just about everybody in the islands understands it. That's the strongest density of Scots anywhere, along with Shetland and the Doric and Aberdeenshire. Well, in Orkney, we don't fairly think of it as a dialect of Scots, but just its own thing. Linguistically, it is a dialect of Scots, but for whatever reason, history or culture or politics, Orkney has always had in itself a pet for Scotland. That makes a bit of a fankle or a phrase like Scotland's languages. What if me language is no awful keen on being Scotland's? What if most folk that speak it dinna think of it as a proper language, but just the way we speak? I'm gotten a PhD in minority language literature, and one of the things I researched was how national languages in Europe has always been made through empire, that standard language is a tool of colonisation, and languages like English or French is always made by centralised power to exclude the periphery. Do we want Scots to try and do the same thing? Or no? Is it another way of thinking about language? No as one fix-it thing, but a spectrum of ways of speaking that's all deserving of support. Yin's the question I'm bringing the day. Whatever poor does, there's aye folk that'll do their own thing with words and make their own thran poor that way.
Thank you, Harry, Josephine, and now Jamie Ria, who is going to also introduce themselves.
Hello and thank you. I want to start off by giving a visual description of myself. I am a white male, a queer person with ginger hair and a ginger beard, and I've got a Scottish tartan cap on with a shirt that's kind of like a photograph of a building that's kind of been you've taken the colours out of it, and I have striped blue trousers on as well. I grew up in Northern Ireland and moved to Glasgow in 2015. I am one of the first cohort in the RCS in a course called Performance in BSL and English. I graduated in 2018 and I'm a BSL user. That's my first language. Since graduating, I have started to, and I started an explorative process in all different forms of art, as a performer, as a producer, as a creator. In July there to October, I also worked with Squiff in creating, for the first time, some films for them. And I'm also a BSL consultant, so I work with theatres mostly. I want to say how honoured I am to be part of this conversation today. For me, I feel a real connection to the subject, the title, because of the artistic work that I do and the community that I'm from. I feel that it's a huge part of it. I am a bilingual person and I'm also part of the artist community. So I'm in quite a unique position, I think, that way, but it's a strength to be able to represent both of those communities equally. I feel that it's important that BSL is centred within our industry and that I want to be a huge part of that going forward, because deaf people BSL users in our community find their motivation. And it's really important for them to be able to see themselves represented within the industry, and on panels like this with people like you, for us all to be able to share that and to be represented together. I want to make sure that I'm part of that contribution as we go forward. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Jamie, for your introduction. Loved it. Harry, Josephine, I wanted to ask you, just thinking about what you just said in your opener, and you mentioned how whatever power does, there are always people who'll do their own things with words and make their own dissident power that way. And it just, because I got to read it before, it made me think of like how words obviously have power, and the languages words are spoken and heard in have power too. And do you think for someone who is bilingual, in Scotland, does the power of your words, or how does the power of your words change depending on the language you're speaking?
Well, that's a big question.
Yes. Sorry.
I think the truth is that most folk are bilingual in one sense or another, or maybe more accurately, I think most folk engage in code switching. That most folk, even if they say they only speak one language, will have multiple registers of that language that they use in different places. One version of it that they speak with their friends, one version of it that they use at work, one version of it that they use in their poetry or whatever. And we switch quite naturally between these codes. And for folk that have different language communities, whether that's Scots and English or any other kind of set of language communities that coexist, sometimes together, sometimes in conflict, that code switching can become very pronounced. And nationality or language community is one of the ways that that's pronounced. Class is another major way that that's pronounced. With Scots especially, Scots is a language that is often marked now in the 21st century as either working class or rural. It's not thought of truly that often as a national language that everybody in the nation speaks. When folk open their mouth and speak Scots, because of where the strong language communities of Scotland are, it's thought of as a working class language or as a rural language or both. And that means that when you speak it, poor relations are there in your mouth as you're speaking. And we're all conscious of that. We deploy these poor relations. We use words and languages and codes to communicate to each other what our social positions are and why we think about each other. And that can come down to individual words. It can come down to prepositions. One of the things I think about Orkney often, and it's the same in Shetland, is that fairly uniquely, not entirely, but quite rarely among languages in these islands, Orkney maintains a distinction between the formal and the familiar second-person pronoun. So the formal second-person pronoun is you, as it is in English, but the familiar one that you use for folk that you're familiar with your family, with folk that are junior to you, is thou, which is the same as the Old English thou. It's the same thing. And it's not so common in Orkney anymore, but if somebody uses thou with you, that marks a social relation directly of what you think the poor between you is. And there's folk that I might use that with, and there's folk, especially folk that are older than me, I'd be very cautious of using thou, even if they're using thou with me. So even just down to a single word, we mark who we think about each other in social relation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Harry. Jamie, I wanted to ask you, because obviously you studied at RCS. Sorry. Yeah, because you studied at RCS and then graduated, and obviously now you've just curated for SQUIF, which is the Scottish Queer International Film Festival. And I wanted to know, is there a difference in communities, both hearing and deaf, are engaging with BSL film and BSL theatre? So are people more responsive to BSL film, or are they enjoying it more? Or what are the differences?
Well, I would say within BSL theatre, deaf audiences engaging with that feel that they're on a very familiar footing with the medium. I think if you have a hearing director or, with a hearing theatre company, that's kind of why I became a BSL consultant. It's just simply that you might have a deaf performer on a stage who's being directed by a hearing director. And they don't have that same insight into the language and making sure that it's been well represented on stage. So they need a BSL consultant to connect with them, to allow the artist to focus on their work and their script development within their character, and for me to be able to focus on assessing that language as a director would, normally with a hearing cast member, because I'm able to have that eye. So from the inside, that's kind of where I see the importance of having BSL represented well, so that deaf audiences can connect with that. If you then consider the process of film, if it's a deaf filmmaker who's filming a deaf artist or actor, they're going to represent BSL far more genuinely on film than what they will if it was a hearing person that was filming them. They would tell a different story almost as a hearing filmmaker than a deaf filmmaker would do, because they wouldn't have that BSL eye, that BSL perspective culturally to know what works on screen for a deaf audience. There are differences between cultures, as there are throughout the world. There are differences between cultures. There are barriers. There are journeys that we need to make between those differences. And quite often, if a hearing filmmaker works within a deaf industry, it's the hearing person that then is left with the barrier and not the deaf people that are in that space. So I think each of those elements can give us different outcomes, and audiences can receive that differently too. If you're a hearing director who has deaf friends, you're going to have a better insight than somebody that is not part of that community. But yeah, that's where all that kind of comes together.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is that, and what you're saying is that it's about what's happening in that creative process, and how it's made is then how it influences how an audience can receive it.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Thank you, Jamie. We're going to get into a little bit more, but first we're going to take a break for 10 minutes. But before we take that break for 10 minutes, Harry, Josephine, would you like to read us a little bit from your novel, please?
I will.
Thank you.
I will. So just to set a bit of context, it's a science fiction novel in the Orkney language, in poetry, which is a bit of a pile-up of things. And I just wanted to read a couple of poems from it that engage with language as a question and engage with some of the things that I was just speaking about, this tension between codes. I don't think you need to ken much. One of the central plots is a love story between two characters, Astrid and Darlene. So the first poem is Astrid taking Darlene home for dinner. And I'll tell you about the second poem before that one. And I'm just going to read it in the Orkney. I think the subtitles are going to be in English. I think, because I've sent it to them. We'll see.
will
There's
find
English in the book, so if it does not work, you'll just have to buy the book and get the English. Astrid takes Darlene home for dinner. This is my new friend, and the layers in friend is not fairly clear, and will no be explained. Darlene is winsome now. She's something other as the scar thing our tourist Astrid met. A smile in her fun-tackled face, Rory clays. At the midst of this family hits like her body is lowing. Maybe without no parents learnt at performance. With Darlene's silence about their own feathers, Astrid's hour thankful for her folks met in kindness, until fair into the meal she hears their vowels rounding, their consonants clipping, the words switching to marry Darlene's own, and gets unspeakable barman. And when her own in is one, she sits quiet, wanting a body to notice, her mother to smile and say, "Buddo," and take her back to the old family table. But the help of Astrid's silence has awful gravity, and so the conversation is fagging, fun, is hearing itself, is less and less real getting, till it's just Darlene, it's smiling and specking yet. So that's your awkward dinner. And digging more into the awkwardness, the other kind of central plot in the book is that this space station, Orcadia, which is almost but not entirely unlike Orkney, is gone through a bit of an economic crisis. And this poem is about a young radical for the station called Brenna, who is presenting her theories on what to do about the crisis to the station's council, which in a Nordic tradition is called the Ting. And this is who that goes down. And again, it's about the tension between different ways of thinking and different ways of speaking. Young Brenna at the Ting. Brenna's speechifying. She chants about the inherent inequalities of the interstellar economy, with why the extractive industrial labour relations and light production now require a radical reimagination of Orcadia's poor, with why the FTL drive was no a threat, but an opportunity to show the galaxy what way they work a better way. She speaks Guy Wheel. She has been practising her arguments for weeks. Lass, thanks for that, says Anne, the eldest there, and I the chair they dinna have. No, the stores. Had on, Brenna Golders, horrid read get in. Are we no going to discuss what I'm speaking about? Yes, says Anne, couthy and blind. Was got in something they're wanting or needing to say just now to Brenna's clever notions. The full ha is dainty silent, and silent yet. Brenna didna ken to practice for this, and Anne is practised all their life. Unhosts. No, the stores.
Thank you so much, Harry, Josephine. Yeah, that was really nice. It was really nice. And it makes me want to buy your book. So I think I'm going to have to go and do that. So well done.
Actually, yeah.
Excellent. Excellent promo. Amazing. We're going to come back in 10 minutes. My watch is still in Brussels time, but I think 3 o'clock. Yeah. Hello. Thank you. Hi. Amazing. We're back. Cool. Thank you everyone so much for your openers and your contributions and sharing your work with us before the break. I've got lots of questions and points and things I really want to get into. And the first one is, so Harry Josephine, this is going to be a question for everyone, but Harry Josephine, you mentioned in your opener again, or you raised the question, is there another way of thinking about language, not as a fixed thing, but as a spectrum of ways of speaking that all deserve support? And so I wanted to ask to the panel, how do we begin to change how we think about language in Scotland? And I don't know who wants to go first.
Don't let your tongue be faster than your mind. Because sometimes people create an idea about me, for example, and start bunching me for that idea without knowing who I am or what I'm. And through language, I think you can explain yourself, your culture, your politics, your human rights, your identity, and communicate with the other people. So I think is back to the understanding. And I think that's just to narrow that distance between people and make them more closer to make judgment about others. I think that's my answer to that.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you. It's like understanding and slowing things down and listening. And yeah. Sorry, Ghazi, were you going to say something? No. Okay. Jamie?
I think for me, and for the language I use, being BSL, and feeling how much support that receives in comparison to hearing people who might want to work with me or people that are just focusing on their own work. To think, first of all, in general social settings, BSL is represented, but it's often represented through a hearing interpreter connecting us together in a kind of triangle, as a deaf person with a hearing person and an interpreter. And it's always okay to ask. I think that anybody that's sharing a space should feel they have the right to ask, what's the word for this? What's the sign for that? And any language should be open to being interrogated and shared, and we should always be welcoming to each other, no matter what language we use. It's okay also to forget the next day. I think it's as long as you always maintain an open mind, and not just an open mind to ask, but also to receive. Regardless of the communities that we're in, we're going to always have differences within our between our communities. And I think we find the common ground when we actually ask the questions of one another. Most of the time when I'm working with hearing people. That's the majority of my working life since I've moved to Glasgow. And what I really appreciate is when the people that I'm working with actually start to understand the importance of having an interpreter there and not just trying to get by, or of trying to communicate directly with me when an interpreter isn't available, and working towards using an interpreter less. I think that COVID seemed to give people the time and space to stop and think about what is required for accessibility. And I think that it's become better. I think there seems to be more understanding, more general understanding about access and equality to a space.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie.
I think a big part of the answer is in the education system and has to be. And I think in finding that, we have to start by understanding that the British public education system was explicitly created to make these islands monolingual. That one of the functions of British public education was to establish English as the dominant and only language in these islands. And that from the start, the only other languages that were taught were first dead classical languages, which, you know, have their own role, and second, other languages of European colonization, French, German, which again have their own role. But those methods were deliberately marginalising minority languages within these islands, Scots, Gaelic, Welsh, Irish. That was very intentional, and also stigmatising working class forms of speech and rural forms of speech. And that was very deliberate within the education system. So what we have to do now is to reimagine who language is taught in education. Some of that is straightforward in theory, although takes a lot of reworking in practice, which is building multilingualism into education in these islands from the start. Multilingualism, not just in Scotland's languages, but in all the languages that are spoken in these islands, in this place. So not just Scots, Gaelic, English, but also Arabic, Urdu, Polish, languages with big speaking communities that should be part of the way that folk think and speak in these islands. So it's partly teaching multilingualism from the start, understanding that that strengthens education, that strengthens young folks' ways of thinking about the world and ability to move through the world. And it has benefits for other aspects of education. And then the other half of it is also removing this process of teaching proper English as central to the education system. It's a nonsense. It's useful. I like the fact that I can be flexible and strong in English, but I want folk to be proud of the different ways that they speak English, the dissident forms of English, and those should be celebrated and supported by a creative education, not forced out by a forced monolingualism in education.
Thank you, Harry, Josephine.
I couldn't agree more, Josie. Typical is the situation of Gaelic, for example, that is a curriculum based on an English curriculum. Therefore, parts of it will never work. I guess things have changed. When my mother went to school, she got belted for speaking Gaelic. And my father used to fight for Gaelic medium educations, and they've come now, thankfully, and things have moved on. But again, going back to what Ghazi said about understanding, I think sometimes when people, for example, whether it's Scots or Gaelic that they put down on, or Doric, what's the use of those, there's a real fear there, I think, from people. And I think that comes down to understanding and education, as Josie said, to understand that we're all equal, just that we happen to speak different languages, and more languages we have and understand and share, the better.
Thank you, Artair. And Jamie, you were going to say?
Everything that you're sharing is a similar reflection to what the deaf community have experienced in their education systems. You know, deaf people, I come from a deaf family, and we don't use English much. It wasn't until I went to school that we were taught in English, and that's the way that the deaf community have been taught for a long time. They've been forced to not use signed language, but to use an English spoken language or English written language. And when I was at home, I would be using BSL, but when I was at school, I'd be using sign supported English, and almost losing some of the rules of grammar that I'd learnt at home with the natural language development that I'd had there. And so, not just that, but then being forced to speak and taught to speak. sometimes even been taught to speak French, when really I wanted to be learning about the beautiful depths of BSL. In Scotland, there's the BSL Act, and I'm so pleased that that's there and that the community has the BSL Act, and that it has been, there is a plan to roll that out in schools more than what it currently is at the moment. I think there's such a huge need there, not just for BSL, but for the signed languages of France or Spain or other countries as well, and to keep the language relative to the person. I think that everything that you're saying there, it just reflects really strongly with me as well. It just resounds in my memory and experiences. And also children should have a right to choice of which language they would like. Not just that a teacher is saying, you are here and I'm going to teach you French, for example, when that's not the language that they really want to be operating in or learning about. There should be more fight for rights for language.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Artair, you mentioned about your mother getting the belt for speaking Gaelic, and now you're flourishing. Flourishing? You're doing well in your career, I suppose. You're flourishing in your career. Using the language. And I wanted to know, are people, there was obviously a shift between your childhood and your mother's, and in terms of the language and how it was received. Has there been another shift now, or is it still the same as to when you were growing up?
I think it's constantly shifting. Yeah, as Jamie said, when I went to school, I had no English, but I very quickly had to learn English or I was going to get left behind. So I think at least I didn't get the belt, not for speaking Gaelic anyway. So, I think now, we have Gaelic medium units throughout Scotland. In Glasgow, we have 3 primary schools feeding into the secondary school. And overall throughout Scotland, there's quite a demand for Gaelic education. I think the worry is there won't be enough teachers. So, and I think, the Gaelic, the language itself has evolved as well to more, not what you'd call an RP, I guess, but more of a kind of standardised kind of way of speaking. For example, where I come from, Tiree, we use quite a lot of dialectal difference compared to the Isle of Lewis and different places. So I think that Gaelic's been standardised in schools now, so it's almost all the young people learn the same kind of one for fit for all. But I think that's a good thing about being out in schools is when I'm working with young people, I'll discuss the other words that you can use in different areas, because I think that's just as important to keep the richness of the language alive rather than make it this one bog standard kind of one fits all.
Yeah, it's like the richness and the nuances and the differences that make it, that you want to preserve, right? That's like culture. That's how you,
the thing about the language now is it's in a healthy state, I guess. And young people now, I guess, if they come from Glasgow, it's quite funny because they'll have a different accent from what I have, obviously, coming from the islands. And it's evolving in that sense too, that people around the world are learning Gaelic, and they go to Skye, to the college, or different things. So I think the blast, as they say, the taste or the dialectal taste you have is possibly changing as well. But that makes it more interesting as well.
That's exciting. Ghazi, you've mentioned a couple of times today about language and how it shows your identity. And can give clues to your identity or your history or your past or where you're from. And I wondered, coming to Scotland, how has your relationship to your first language of Arabic changed?
It was difficult, but there is a saying in Arabic said, when you know the language of your neighborhood, you avoid their devil act. That's one thing. And There's another saying, which is a good one. Your language is your horse. Tide it well or ride it well. Yeah, I think is the difficulties was disrespect. Respecting costs nothing but mean a lot. But when you speak other language and people not understand that, it's kind of, they feel you are like insulting them, asking you to speak English, which is, I cannot speak it. I can listen. And when I listen, I look to your face. Your face is smiling, I will say yes. Whatever you say, I will say yes, okay. But when you change your tune, I start saying no. No, that's the barrier. But there is, I think, crucial part in any communication is the respect there. If it's there, everything we can communicate, even if we don't really have a common language. But if there's no respect, even if we have a common language, we're not going to communicate.
It's that respect again and the patience to want to communicate and want to hear and speak to others. We're almost at time. I've got like one more question, but I wondered if anybody in the audience has any questions for any of our panelists. Yes.
Embodies so much culture, and how much will be lost if we don't do what Fruits suggested, which is to preserve the language. It's not just the communication element, but it's the heritage element. I just want to ask people's views on that.
Okay. Yeah, so catch me if I've got this wrong, but how preserving heritage and culture through language. How do we do that? How important is that?
I think you're right that a language is a culture, and a language is a cultural memory, and a language is a way of thinking about the place, and that's all true and important, and is one of the many reasons for strengthening multilingualism, preserving threatened languages. I think also that a language is a way of thinking about the future and a way of creating the future. And I think these two things are part of the same picture. And the reason I emphasize the future and the reason for writing a science fiction novel is that often we think about threatened languages as dwindling, and we think about them kind of in this temporality of the past, that especially like languages like Scots and also Gaelic get persistently cast as languages of the past. So when we only speak about this is our memory, this is our history, sometimes we risk playing into that, which is not to disagree with you, but to say yes, and these are ways of thinking about the future, because there's words for future technologies in Scots. We have a word for wind turbines in Arcadian. We're a marine energy research centre in Orkney. Orkney is a way of thinking about the future because it's also got a language that carries a cultural memory and a past.
Thank you, Harry, Josephine. Does anybody else have anything to add? Yeah, Jamie?
I might be sidestepping a little bit from what we're talking about, but it is in relation to preservation of a language. In BSL, there has been, the evolution of language. BSL has expanded, has grown exponentially from years gone by when a lot of terminology was relayed by fingerspelling. There weren't the same pieces of vocabulary attached to that language. However, it was held in the body, it was held in the face, it was held in the culture, it was held in the way that language was relayed. And it's grown with its vocabulary over the years. So people are far more fluent with syntax and grammar than what they were in years gone by. To add on to the idea about two people that you were saying not understanding one another if respect isn't there, I think that point echoes in the deaf community as well. I think it echoes internationally. You know, there is no one internationally recognised signed language. However, you could meet somebody from Hungary as a deaf person and appreciate that you have different languages, but adapt your signed language to a more gestural, international version of language and use visual cues and visual metaphors to get your point across far more easily than I think you can with spoken languages. And I remember going to Budapest from Ireland for a week, and I'd never met this person that I met in Budapest. And the sign language that they used, we first of all were working between ourselves with interpreters. And we were sitting watching the whole process between interpreters and then eventually communicating with each other. And people were saying, have you two met before? And we were saying, no. But actually, there is power within a visual language and using visual markers within language to create a more international connection that sometimes isn't as easily done with spoken language. So there's a lot of power that we hold within our languages too.
Yeah, I think if I just add to that, I mean, going into the schools, I think very much, you know, Gaelic and Scots very much cast aside as, oh, it's dying. It's the absolute reverse is true, I think. When I go into the school and I work with those young people and say, what's the word for this? I go, hang on a minute till I think of that. And then I'll think of it. And then they go on and they've got the new word in Gaelic or whatever, and they can go, and they are the future. They are going to spread, and it's international now because we've got technology. People will know there's only 60,000 Gaelic speakers, but there's 800,000 have visited Duolingo and so on, you know. And mainly, there's over 7,000 languages over the world, and most of them have less than 100,000 speakers. Yep. And you can learn any language on it, so none of us have a reason to be disrespectful or anything like that. So the youngsters are the future.
Thank you. We have a question from someone on Zoom. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Ariel Kilik. And they have asked, they've commented, I suppose, I love how everyone is talking about respect, diversity, listening to other people, and forcing people to change their language, etc. Would super love to hear the panel's views on forcing language and how that impacts women. How that impacts women. Does anyone want to? It's quite a big question.
Can you repeat the question for me, please? Of course I can.
I love how everyone is talking about respect, diversity, listening to other people, and forcing people to change their language. So, forcing people to change their language. Okay. Would super love to hear the panel's view on forcing language and how that impacts women. So I'm guessing assuming by forcing, that means if you don't have a choice, if you're in an environment where you can't speak another language, where people don't want to hear your language, or there's not that respect there, I think. That's also okay if nobody has an answer.
No, there's just so much I'd like to say. But I'm thinking I'm thinking about the code switching that happens between
Yeah.
gendered spaces, and I'm thinking about I'm thinking about who, and I'm thinking about when I'm in a meeting, and sometimes I'm often the only trans person in a meeting, I'm often the only woman in a meeting. That happens to me a lot. And I'm thinking about, I was speaking with my mother about this just this week, about the ways that folk use language and social codes between themselves, the way that men use language and social codes between themselves to reinforce a brotherhood, to reinforce a particular kind of sociality, even when it's not intentional, or even when the intention isn't spoken, how often that leaves me feeling on the outside of whatever conversation is happening. And I think about how when I come into a space, I am often carrying the burden of representation, the burden where I'm supposed to represent a community, often a trans community or a queer community, which I absolutely cannot represent in any way, but I am the carrier of that community and of its language, and I have to carry kind of the heaviness of that on me, and what words I choose to use, what things I choose to say, which is why I was just thinking about how do I answer this question, because my gender is fraught in this space, and everything that I say carries like the weight of that fraughtness, which is extremely difficult. So I suppose my answer to that is that sometimes I choose to reflect and adapt myself to the codes that are going on, to like insinuate myself into the space and get things that I think I want, or things that I want from my community, say if I'm in a space with civil servants from the government. And sometimes I choose to disrupt the dominant language of that space and insert into it words and thoughts and languages that that space does not want to hear. So it's both of those things.
Yes. Thank you, Harry, Josephine. Jamie?
I think I just wanted to add to what you were saying, Josie. I think giving the example of linguistic development in BSL with gender and pronouns and other terms that are out with the binary. Binary terms are so powerful. You know, even the sign in BSL for people is woman, man. That becomes the sign people. And now you're seeing a lot of changes like this sign for people, which is basically just showing the individuals. So that there isn't a control of gender there, or an inference of gender there. And that it's not about the binary, but it's about the human. And so those changes are happening within BSL in relation to gender, and those sign terms are developing as they have with other languages.
Thank you, Jamie. That also just made me think of how Josephine said that Orcadian as a language can be the future, and like the possibilities within BSL to keep redeveloping and reimagining as we add more words to our language, right? There's something really beautiful that can happen there. That's us. I was going to try and find a really nice way to say that, but I can't. Thank you so much to our wonderful, wonderful panel. It's been a really insightful conversation, and I also kind of frustrating because I feel you've all got so much like experience and thought to share, and we've hardly scratched the surface. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience at home on Zoom, and our audience here as well.